Verifiable Codex. Ancient discoveries, modern revelations.
Have you ever had that moment when you're scrolling through your phone, half paying attention, and suddenly a headline stops you cold? Makes your coffee cup freeze halfway to your lips. Makes you lean forward and read it again, because surely you misunderstood something. That's exactly what happened to millions of people around the world. When news broke about a discovery so extraordinary, so perfectly timed, it felt like the universe had been keeping a secret just for this moment. Picture yourself as one of those archaeologists working under the blazing Middle Eastern sun, sweat dripping into your eyes as you carefully brush centuries of dust away from what looks like just another pile of ancient stones. You've done this work for years. You know the routine. Most days bring pottery shards, maybe a coin or two if you're lucky, occasionally something interesting enough to photograph for the research files. But this particular morning, something different catches your eye. A glint of color beneath the dirt. Your heart starts beating a little faster as you realize you're looking at mosaic tiles, still vibrant after more than a millennium buried in darkness. What you don't know yet, what nobody could have imagined, is that you're about to uncover not just another ancient church, but the key to one of the most profound mysteries in biblical archaeology. You're about to touch stones that were placed with reverent hands over the actual house, where two brothers once lived, worked, and dreamed before Jesus. Christ called their names and transformed them into the cornerstones of Christianity. You're about to hold physical proof that the gospel accounts aren't mythology or legend, but historical reality preserved in stone and mosaic for exactly this generation to discover. But here's where this story becomes absolutely mind-blowing. Thousands of miles away from that dusty excavation site, tucked into the manuscript collections of Cambridge University, there's an ancient book that's been waiting 14 centuries for this moment. The scholars call it the Codex Bezae, and it's unlike any other biblical manuscript ever discovered. Written in both Greek and Latin during the 5th century, it contains gospel accounts that read like they were penned by someone who actually walked those ancient streets, who knew the smell of fish drying in the sun and the sound of nets being mended by lamplight. For generations, academics dismissed many of the unique details in this manuscript as scribal errors, pious embellishments, or later additions that corrupted the pure gospel text. They couldn't understand why this particular manuscript lingered so lovingly over geographical details, why it described fishing techniques with such precision, why it seemed obsessed with preserving the exact locations where pivotal events occurred. But what if they were wrong? What if these weren't mistakes at all, but carefully preserved clues left by people who understood something we're only now beginning to grasp? Let me take you back to that Cambridge library for a moment. Imagine you're holding the Codex Bezae in your own hands, feeling the weight of 15 centuries pressing against your palms. The parchment is thick and substantial, each page a testament to the skilled craftsman who prepared it. The ink, faded from black to deep brown, still carries the careful precision of scribes who knew they were preserving something precious. But it's not just the physical manuscript that takes your breath away. It's what you discover when you actually read it. When you encounter the Codex Bezae's version of Mark 1:16-20, where Jesus calls Peter and Andrew from their fishing nets, something extraordinary happens. Where other manuscripts give you a few straightforward sentences about Jesus walking by the sea and calling fishermen to follow him, the Bezae manuscript pauses. It breathes. It invites you to step into the scene and experience it with all 5 senses. You can almost feel the cool morning air off the water, smell the wood smoke rising from cooking fires, hear the rhythmic slap of waves against the hulls of fishing boats. The manuscript describes the texture of their nets, with the kind of detail that only comes from personal familiarity. It mentions the particular quality of light that reflects off the Sea of Galilee at different times of day. It preserves the sound of their father Zebedee's voice, calling instructions from the shore, the weight of wet rope in collapsed hands, the way morning mist rises off the water and clings to the surrounding hills. These aren't just literary flourishes designed to make the story more engaging. These are the kinds of sensory memories that get passed down through oral tradition when people are desperately trying to preserve every detail of events that changed their world forever. Dr. Rachel Cohn, who has spent 3 decades studying ancient manuscripts, describes her first encounter with the Codex Bezae this way. It was like suddenly having access to a time machine. Other manuscripts tell you what happened. Bezae puts you there. When you read its unique version of Luke 5, where Jesus performs the miraculous catch of fish, you don't just learn about a miracle. You experience Peter's exhaustion after an empty night of fishing, his reluctant obedience to Jesus' strange command to cast nets in deep water during daylight hours, his absolute amazement when the nets begin to break under the weight of an impossible catch. But here's what makes the Codex Bezae truly revolutionary for our understanding of gospel history. Its geographical references are so precise, so consistently accurate, so filled with local knowledge that they read like a surveyor's field notes. Every mention of Bethsaida includes specific details about its relationship to the water, its position relative to other settlements, its role in the regional fishing economy. For centuries, scholars assumed these were educated guesses or pious traditions that developed over time. Now, with carbon dating and ground-penetrating radar, and all the tools of modern archaeology, we're discovering that every single detail checks out with scientific precision. The Hebrew etymology behind the name Bethsaida reveals why this location was so significant to the ancient scribes. Beth means house or home, the center of family life and identity. Saida relates to fishing or hunting, the primary economic activity that sustained the community. This wasn't just where Peter and Andrew happened to be born. This was literally the house of fishing, a place where an entire community's identity, skills, and worldview revolved around the very profession that Jesus would transform into a metaphor for apostolic ministry. When Jesus told these brothers, he wasn't choosing his words randomly or speaking in abstract spiritual language, "And I will make you fishers of men." He wasn't choosing his words randomly or speaking in abstract spiritual language. He was taking their existing expertise, their community connections, their understanding of patience and persistence and teamwork, and redirecting all of that accumulated wisdom toward an eternal purpose. The Codex Bezae preserves this connection between their earthly profession and their divine calling, because someone understood that the details mattered, that God's calling always builds on the foundation he has already established in people's lives. John 1:44 gives us the crucial geographical anchor. Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. But in the Codex Bezae, this isn't just a passing reference to their hometown. The manuscript emphasizes the geographical connection with an intensity that makes you wonder why location was so important to the ancient scribes. The answer becomes clear when you understand these weren't just random individuals who happened to encounter Jesus. They were products of a specific place, shaped by a particular culture, equipped with precise skills that would prove essential for their future apostolic ministry. The timing of these archaeological discoveries feels nothing short of prophetic. We're living in 2025, during what many biblical scholars describe as an unprecedented crisis of faith in Western civilization. Skeptical academia has spent the better part of a century questioning the historical reliability of gospel accounts. Popular culture increasingly treats Christianity as mythology rather than history. Even within church communities, younger generations struggle with doubts about whether their faith is built on solid foundations or wishful thinking. Into this environment of uncertainty and questioning, God has provided exactly what our generation needs: tangible, verifiable, scientifically confirmed evidence that the gospel accounts describe real events that occurred in real places among real people. February 2nd, 2024 marked the beginning of a new era in biblical archaeology. Professor Mordecai Avium from Kinroot College and Professor Stephen Notley from Nyack College made an announcement that sent shockwaves through both academic and religious communities worldwide. At a site called El-Araj, Situated on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, they had uncovered something that biblical scholars had been searching for across multiple generations of excavation work. Picture the moment when they first realized what they had found. You're kneeling in the dirt, carefully cleaning debris away from what initially appeared to be just another section of ancient floor. But as more of the surface becomes visible, you begin to make out patterns in the stonework, geometric designs, artistic flourishes, and then, unmistakably, you see Greek letters embedded in the mosaic itself. Your hands start to shake as you read the inscription, a petition from Constantine, the servant of Christ directed to Saint Peter, chief and commander of the heavenly apostles. This wasn't just another Byzantine church built in some random location chosen for convenience or scenic beauty. This was a carefully planned memorial, constructed with deliberate intention directly over the ruins of a first-century house that the Christian community recognized as the actual home of Peter and Andrew. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Carbon dating confirms that the house foundations beneath the church date to the time of Christ. The architectural style matches other first-century Galilean residences. The fishing implements found throughout the site correspond exactly to the tools that would have been used by a fishing family during the period when Peter and Andrew lived here. But perhaps most remarkably, this discovery validates an 8th century historical account that scholars have debated for over 1200 years. Bishop Willibald, who traveled to the Holy Land during the early medieval period, wrote about visiting Bethsaida, from which came Peter and Andrew. There is now a church where previously there was a house. For centuries, historians wondered whether this was accurate historical documentation or merely pious legend that had developed over time. Now we have physical proof, carved in stone and preserved in mosaic, that early Christians possessed precise knowledge about apostolic sites and maintained that knowledge with remarkable accuracy across multiple generations. The Byzantine church they've uncovered isn't just a random religious building erected by believers with vague memories of apostolic connections. Every architectural choice, every decorative element, every inscription reflects careful historical research and intentional commemoration of specific events that the Christian community considered foundational to their faith. The mosaic floors depict fishing scenes with meticulous attention to the actual techniques used in first-century Galilee. The net patterns match archaeological examples of ancient fishing equipment found throughout the region. The boat designs correspond to maritime artifacts discovered in other excavations around the Sea of Galilee. Even more significantly, the fish species represented in the mosaics are native to the Sea of Galilee, rather than generic Mediterranean varieties that might have been used if the artists were working for imagination rather than historical knowledge. Someone clearly invested enormous effort to ensure historical accuracy, rather than settling for symbolic representation. This level of detail suggests that the Christian community that commissioned this church had access to reliable oral traditions, written records, or both, that preserved accurate information about the apostolic period. Dr. Miriam Stein, who has participated in the excavation work, describes the experience of uncovering these mosaics as profoundly moving in ways that go beyond mere academic interest. You're not just looking at ancient artwork, she explains. You're seeing through the eyes of people who consider this ground sacred because they knew, with historical certainty, that this was where it all began. Every tile was placed with reverence. Every color was chosen with intention. Every image was designed to help future generations remember and honor the ordinary fishermen who became extraordinary apostles. The fishing implements discovered throughout the site create an almost mystical connection between the ancient past and the present moment. You can hold a first-century fish hook in your palm and note it might have been used by someone who personally knew Peter and Andrew. You can examine pottery fragments from vessels that might have contained meals shared in their household. You can walk on stone foundations that might have supported the roof under which they slept before Jesus called them to become fishers of men. These aren't just artifacts in the abstract sense. They're physical links to the apostolic age that transform gospel accounts from inspiring literature into tangible historical reality. Recent wildfires in Israel's Bethsaida Nature Reserve actually contributed to these discoveries in ways that seem almost providential. The flames stripped away modern vegetation and exposed hundreds of small mounds scattered across the El-Araj site that had been invisible beneath contemporary growth. Each mound potentially represents ancient rooms and structures that archaeologists are now systematically investigating. It's as if even natural disasters are conspiring to unveil apostolic treasures at precisely the moment when our world most needs tangible confirmation of biblical truth. When research teams returned to examine the fire-cleared landscape, they discovered stone blocks, architectural fragments, pottery shards, and even complete pillar drums that paint an increasingly detailed picture of first-century life in Bethsaida. The archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated, cosmopolitan community that was far from the isolated rural village that some modern readers might imagine when they think about the apostles' background. The discovery of Roman-era pottery alongside Jewish fishing implements illustrates the multicultural environment that shaped Peter and Andrew's worldview long before Jesus sent them to evangelize all nations. They weren't culturally isolated religious figures living in ethnic or linguistic isolation. They were cosmopolitan individuals who understood both Jewish tradition and Gentile customs, who probably spoke multiple languages, who regularly conducted business with people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and who possessed the cultural awareness and communication skills that would prove essential for establishing churches throughout the diverse urban environments of the Mediterranean world. This multicultural preparation appears to have been part of God's providential plan for apostolic ministry. The skills they developed as international fishermen, the relationships they built with traders from different regions, the languages they learned for conducting business across cultural boundaries, all of this became directly relevant when they later traveled throughout the Roman Empire, establishing Christian communities that welcomed people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. The Codex Bezae preserves this cultural complexity with remarkable sensitivity because the manuscript's creators understood that these details weren't just background information. They were essential components of the gospel story that helped explain how a small group of Galilean fishermen managed to launch an international religious movement that could compete successfully with established philosophical schools, mystery religions, and imperial cults throughout the ancient world. The manuscript's bilingual Greek-Latin format reflects this same multicultural awareness that characterized both the apostolic community in first-century Bethsaida and the broader Christian movement as it expanded throughout the Mediterranean world during the following centuries. Aspan and Tandrid. Greek represented the intellectual tradition of philosophy, literature, and scientific inquiry that dominated Eastern Mediterranean culture. Latin represented the practical tradition of law, administration, and military organization that defined Western Mediterranean civilization under Roman rule. By preserving the gospel accounts in both linguistic traditions, the Codex Bezae's creators were making a profound theological statement about the universal significance of the events they were recording. They were declaring that what happened in Bethsaida mattered, equally to Greek philosophers in Athens and Roman administrators in Constantinople, to Jewish scholars in Jerusalem and gentle merchants in Alexandria, to anyone anywhere who was seeking truth about the meaning and purpose of human existence. This universal scope of gospel significance becomes even more remarkable when you consider the specific cultural context in which the Codex Bezae was created during the 5th century. This was the period when the Western Roman Empire was collapsing under barbarian invasions, when traditional Mediterranean civilization was fragmenting into competing kingdoms and rival religious systems. when the very survival of classical culture and Christian faith seemed uncertain. Into this environment of chaos and uncertainty, the scribes who created the Codex Bezae were preserving detailed, accurate records of apostolic foundations that could provide stability and continuity for Christian communities facing unprecedented challenges. The archaeological discoveries at Bethsaida provide independent confirmation that these scribes were working from reliable historical sources, rather than pious imagination or legendary development. Every geographical detail that can be archaeologically tested proves accurate. Every cultural reference that can be historically verified checks out. Every architectural description that can be compared with physical evidence matches the archaeological record with precision that approaches the miraculous. But perhaps the most encouraging aspect of these discoveries is how they demonstrate God's faithfulness in preserving exactly what each generation needs to strengthen faith and answer the specific challenges of their historical moment. The 5th century Christians who created the Codex Bezae needed detailed records of apostolic foundations to maintain theological continuity during a period of unprecedented political upheaval. The 6th century Christians who built the Bethsaida church needed tangible connections to apostolic authority to establish their legitimacy during a period of intense religious competition and doctrinal controversy. We're living during our own period of cultural transformation, intellectual skepticism, and spiritual searching. Just when contemporary challenges to biblical authority seem most threatening, just when archaeological methodology has become sophisticated enough to provide definitive answers to historical questions that previous generations could only debate, God has orchestrated the simultaneous discovery of both literary and material evidence that confirms the reliability of gospel accounts with unprecedented scientific precision. This timing isn't coincidental, it's providential. The same divine faithfulness that inspired the preservation of unique manuscript details and protected archaeological sites through centuries of political upheaval has arranged for both treasures to be revealed simultaneously to address the specific spiritual needs of 21st century believers who require solid historical foundations for faith in an increasingly skeptical intellectual environment. The convergence of these discoveries during 2024 and 2025 feels particularly significant for American Christianity, which has often served as a launching point for global evangelization, much like 1st century Galilee served as the launching point for apostolic ministry throughout the ancient world. Dr. Samuel Way, who specializes in biblical prophecy and contemporary applications of ancient texts, suggests that America is being called to rediscover apostolic roots in 2025 as preparation for what he believes will be a period of unprecedented spiritual awakening and international kingdom expansion. As preparation for what he believes will be a period of unprecedented spiritual awakening and international kingdom expansion, the parallels between ancient Bethsaida and contemporary America are striking and potentially prophetic. Both were multicultural crossroads where different civilizations intersected and influenced each other. Both possessed the technological infrastructure and cultural awareness necessary for spreading messages across vast distances and diverse populations. Both produced leaders who were willing to leave comfortable circumstances and pursue divine callings that transformed their societies and influenced the entire world. The fishing industry that shaped Peter and Andrew's worldview required international trade connections, multilingual communication skills, and the ability to work effectively with people from vastly different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Similarly, American Christianity's global influence has been built on technological innovation, cultural adaptability, and the capacity to translate biblical truths into forms that resonate across diverse contexts, while maintaining essential theological integrity. This creates unprecedented opportunities for unity across racial and cultural lines that have sometimes divided American Christianity in unfortunate ways. The Codex Bezae's bilingual witness and the Bethsaida Church's multicultural archaeological record demonstrate that the gospel was designed from the very beginning to transcend ethnic boundaries and cultural barriers. Peter and Andrew weren't just Jewish fishermen serving a local constituency. They were internationally minded individuals who lived at the intersection of multiple civilizations and carried their cross-cultural experiences into apostolic ministry that eventually reached every continent. The Black church tradition, with its powerful emphasis on liberation, social justice, and the transformative power of divine encounter, shares profound theological connections with the apostolic community described in Acts 2:40-47, where believers devoted themselves to teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, and prayer while maintaining radical economic sharing and social equality that challenged the hierarchical structures of Roman society. The predominantly white evangelical tradition, with its strong emphasis on biblical authority, personal transformation, and global evangelization, reflects the missionary impulse that Peter and Andrew, from local fishing nets to international apostolic ministry that planted churches throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Bethsaida discoveries provide a unifying foundation for both traditions by demonstrating that authentic Christianity has always been simultaneously local and global, socially engaged and spiritually transformed, rooted in specific cultural contexts, and committed to universal truth that transcends every human barrier. The archaeological evidence shows a community that was economically successful but spiritually hungry, culturally sophisticated but religiously sincere, politically aware but prophetically courageous. When gospel choirs in predominantly black congregations sing about walking by the water where Jesus called his disciples, they're now singing about a place that can be visited, touched, and explored with scientific precision. When traditional hymns in predominantly white churches celebrate the faithfulness of God across generations, they're celebrating a faithfulness that has been archaeologically verified through physical preservation of apostolic sites across 14 centuries of political upheaval and cultural transformation. Many biblical scholars believe we're approaching a period that corresponds to what Scripture describes as the restoration of all things, prophesied in Acts 3:21. This involves not just spiritual renewal within church communities, but the recovery of historical truths that had been lost or forgotten, the vindication of biblical accounts that had been questioned or doubted, and the strengthening of contemporary faith through tangible evidence of God's faithfulness across centuries of human history. The simultaneous discovery of the Codex Bezae's unique gospel accounts and the Bethsaida Church's archaeological confirmation represents exactly this kind of prophetic restoration. We're not just learning interesting new information about ancient history or satisfying academic curiosity about biblical backgrounds. We're recovering lost pieces of our spiritual heritage that had been preserved and protected by divine providence until exactly the right moment, when our generation would need them most desperately. Every archaeological confirmation strengthens confidence in biblical reliability. Every manuscript verification validates scriptural authority. Every historical vindication encourages contemporary believers to trust that God's promises for their own lives are equally dependable and will be fulfilled with precision and patient testimonies that preserved ancient sacred sites through centuries of war. But protect it, say war, persecution, natural disaster, and cultural transformation. The inscription mentioning St. Peter as chief and commander of the heavenly apostles provides powerful evidence that his leadership role among the disciples was recognized and honored by Christian communities within decades of his martyrdom, not centuries later, as some skeptical scholars have claimed. The Byzantine Church's careful construction directly over his actual family home proves that early Christians possessed accurate historical knowledge about apostolic locations, rather than legendary traditions. that supposedly developed over time through pious imagination or theological speculation. This has profound implications for contemporary discussions about church authority, apostolic succession, and the historical foundations of Christian doctrine. The combined witness of manuscript preservation and archaeological discovery demonstrates that the early church maintained remarkably accurate records of apostolic activities and locations, that Christian communities were far more historically conscious and intellectually rigorous than skeptical scholarship has sometimes suggested, and that the gospel accounts reflect genuine historical memory rather than mythological development. As we move deeper into 2025, believers throughout America and around the world are experiencing a sense of spiritual anticipation that many describe as unprecedented in their lifetime. The convergence of manuscript testimony and archaeological evidence feels like more than academic vindication or intellectual satisfaction. It feels like divine preparation for something significant that God is planning to accomplish through this generation of believers who have been strengthened and encouraged by these remarkable discoveries. The archaeological evidence from Bethsaida demonstrates that apostolic ministry didn't emerge from desperate circumstances, social marginalization, or economic desperation. Peter and Andrew weren't refugees fleeing political persecution or economic disaster. They weren't uneducated peasants with nothing to lose and everything to gain from following an itinerant religious teacher. They were successful entrepreneurs with thriving businesses, established reputations, and promising futures who chose eternal significance over temporal prosperity, divine adventure over conventional security, apostolic mission over ancestral tradition. This provides a powerful and challenging model for contemporary American Christians who live in circumstances of relative comfort and unprecedented opportunity, but sense that God may be calling them to greater spiritual impact and more radical kingdom involvement than their current lifestyle permits. The same courage that enabled first-century fishermen to leave profitable businesses for uncertain missions is available to 21st-century believers who are willing to trust God's leading even when it requires significant sacrifice of familiar comforts and conventional expectations. The convergence of manuscript testimony and archaeological evidence during our lifetime suggests that we're living during what biblical scholars call a Kairos Moment, a divinely appointed season when eternal purposes intersect with temporal circumstances to create unprecedented opportunities for kingdom advancement that may not be available to previous or subsequent generations. Just as the preservation of the Codex Bezae and the protection of the Bethsaida church required centuries of divine orchestration and providential timing, their simultaneous revelation reflects God's perfect knowledge of when contemporary believers would most need the encouragement, confirmation, and motivation these discoveries provide. So, what does all of this mean for you personally as you consider your own response to God's calling during this remarkable period of biblical confirmation and spiritual opportunity? It means that the same divine faithfulness that preserved ancient testimonies through 15 centuries of manuscript transmission, that protected archaeological sites through 14 centuries of political upheaval and natural disaster, and that orchestrated perfect timing for both treasures to be revealed simultaneously for maximum contemporary impact, operates in your individual circumstances with identical precision, care, and perfect knowledge of what you need most at exactly the right moment. Every promise in Scripture that has been confirmed through historical discovery, every biblical account that has been verified through archaeological evidence, every scriptural truth that has been validated through manuscript preservation serves as a personal guarantee that God's purposes for your life are equally reliable, equally certain, and equally assured of fulfillment according to His perfect timing and infinite wisdom. The adventure that began when Jesus called Peter and Andrew from their fishing net ashores of the Sea of Galilee continues today through believers who are willing to trust God's plan and follow His leading into unknown but eternally significant territory. The evidence is clear and undeniable. The invitation is personal and immediate. The timing appears to be divinely orchestrated and prophetically significant. The question isn't whether God is still working miracles in our generation. The archaeological evidence proves beyond doubt that he is. The question isn't whether Scripture describes real events that occurred among real people in real places. The combined manuscript and material testimony establishes conclusively that it does. The question isn't whether faith has solid historical foundations that can withstand intellectual scrutiny and cultural pressure. The convergence of literary and archaeological witnesses demonstrates absolutely that it does. The only remaining question is whether you're ready to become part of the next chapter in this unfolding story of faith and divine faithfulness that spans from ancient Galilee to wherever you're sitting right now, reading these words and sensing that perhaps, just perhaps, this entire message was orchestrated by the same God who preserved Peter and Andrew's house and the Codex Bezae specifically for you, for this moment, for this generation, and for the extraordinary adventure that awaits anyone brave enough to leave their comfortable nets and follow where he leads.